Not too long ago, Intel said it was redefining its architecture target for mainstream notebook computers. So today, if you buy a 13, 14, 15, even a 17-inch notebook, you're generally going to find a CPU from Intel or AMD in there that's targeted at anywhere from 35 watts to a 55 watt TDP. Now, Intel says by the time Haswell rolls around in 2013, that target for mainstream notebook PCs is going to shift downwards. So with Haswell, it's going to be able to deliver the performance that mainstream notebook users want in a 10 to 20 watt envelope. Now, 10 to 20 watts, that actually puts you in the range of where the MacBook Air CPU, for example, is today, which means that by 2013, all mainstream notebooks will be in this 10 to 20 watt range. They'll be ultra thin, ultra small form factor. Effectively, everything ends up looking like a MacBook Air or something that has those physical characteristics. Now, Intel's also got a new name for this type of notebook PC. It's calling it the Ultrabook. Not quite a tablet, not quite a notebook, it's an Ultrabook. Or another way of looking at it is it's not a netbook, it's better than a netbook, it's an Ultrabook. Today, the term doesn't really mean all that much. Intel has a handful of requirements. The Ultrabooks have to be thin, they have to be light, they have to have some sort of solid-state storage. They have to have good battery life, quick response time, enabled by the SSD, so fast boot times, fast wake from sleep times, things like that. The goal is, within the next 3 years, by the time we get to 2013, you'll see more than just physical aspects to Ultrabooks. So Intel's been talking about always on, always connected features as a part of the Ultrabook family. So the idea is that you'll have your notebook sitting there, it's off, but periodically it'll connect to the internet and grab your latest emails, Twitter updates, Facebook updates, whatever, so that when you do open it up and it's got this like almost instantaneous resume time, you have all your content there. You don't really have to wait for it to download. Those features aren't quite here yet, but that's the ultimate goal. Eventually that stuff should ideally be enabled through like a server-side push. So the notebook doesn't really have to keep waking up to poll and check, but it's kind of told by your servers when it needs to. Anyways, that's the future. Here we are today. Ultrabooks are launching this year. Acer, Toshiba, Asus, they've all kind of joined in. It's not going to be anything major. It's not going to change the world. These things don't really go after tablets. I've seen that comparison made a lot. Tablets are generally sub $500 ARM-based systems. They use alternative mobile OSs, iOS, Android, what have you, Windows 8 eventually. But they're not really geared towards performance. They're still geared towards content consumption. Ultrabooks, on the other hand, at least starting this year, they are going to be Sandy Bridge only. Eventually, they'll be Ivy Bridge and then Haswell. But that's obviously Intel's latest and greatest architecture. These things are going to be much, much faster than tablets. Look at them as mainstream notebook replacements, not really tablet replacements. They don't fall into the same category. Now, I mentioned Asus is one of the launch partners here. And what I have to my left is the Asus Zenbook UX21. So Zenbook is Asus's Ultrabook line. Like I said, given how similar Ultrabooks are to notebooks these days, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to kind of trump up the brand. And I think Asus kind of gets that, which is why they call this thing a Zenbook. The Zenbook family, it's got two models, the UX21 and UX31. The only difference is screen size and available options that you get standard with it. So the 21 is what we're looking at today. It's got an 11.6-inch screen, 13:7 display. If you go to the 31, that's more of a 13-inch MacBook Air competitor. It's got a 13.3-inch panel, and that's a 16:9, 1600 by 900 pixel display. The UX21 is what I requested because me personally, I kind of like the 11-inch MacBook Air form factor, and this is the sort of PC alternative to it. Now, internally, you've got a ultra-low volt Sandy Bridge CPU. This is the i7-2677M. Runs at 1.8 gigahertz, 2 cores with hyper-threading. It's actually really, really fast. For consumer workloads, for browsing the web, writing documents, checking email, all that stuff, it's pretty much as fast as you can get in this type of a form factor. And honestly, and I don't say this much, I do believe it's sufficient for those workloads. And I'm not the type of person that really, will say that, hey, this is enough compute. But for these workloads, honestly, it is, at least today. You don't have a discrete GPU, so you've got Intel HD 3000 graphics. Not great for gaming. You know, you can lightly play things like StarCraft at really, really low settings, but, you know, again, this isn't a gaming machine. It's a browse the web productivity machine. You get 4 gigs of DDR3 standard, and you also get that new pen form factor SSD. Asus actually uses 2 different controllers here. If you get a 128 gig model, which is the entry-level model, you can't get smaller than that. That comes with an ADATA built SandForce SF2281 SSD. And that's actually not even running the 332 firmware that we've talked about online publicly that addresses the infamous BSOD issue. Now, according to Asus, they've done over 50,000 tests on this combination, and they haven't seen any blue screens of death as a cause of the SSD. That is believable to me because we've seen that there are particular platforms that are affected more than others by this particular bug. So although I would like to see Asus embrace the latest version of the SandForce firmware, this thing's running 322, which for Asus is stable, and as long as that, and it's been stable for me, so as long as that continues to be the case, I'm okay with it. If you get a 256 gig drive, you get a SanDisk based controller. And I've published performance specs of all this online, so you just check out the full review on OnTech for if you want details on exactly how the two differ. Asus went for a dual controller option here simply because it needed to meet the Z height requirements of the system. It needed to have SSDs with NAND components only on one side. ADATA couldn't provide it. SanDisk could, and that's why the 256 gig drives come with the NAND on one side. If you want the MacBook Air comparison, yes, the SSD is faster, but I firmly believe that people don't really cross-shop between these two. If you want a Mac, you buy a Mac. If you don't want a Mac, you don't buy a Mac. The only room for cross-shopping right now is if you've got a, you know, if you don't want OS 10, you want Windows 7, and you just want to buy a MacBook Air and run Windows 7 on it. And I'll get to how these two compare in that respect in a second here. Battery life, you're looking at a 35 watt hour unit in here. It's totally integrated, technically not user serviceable, although if you've got a small Torx bit and time to remove like 15 or 16 screws altogether, you can pull it out if you'd like. Integrated 35 watt hour unit, identical in size to the 11-inch MacBook Air. Battery life under Windows, just doing things like web browsing, so on and so forth, we measured about 4.5 hours of continuous use. You can get a little bit more if you are doing a lighter workload, and you can get considerably less if you're just taxing the CPU constantly, I don't know, doing a lot of 3D rendering, so on and so forth. 4.5 hours is pretty much as good as it gets in this type of a form factor. It's not all day battery life, but if you have access to a power outlet, either through meetings or throughout the day, you can actually make this thing work. So that takes care of battery life. Performance, as I mentioned, Sandy Bridge, I'm a big fan of. It performs as expected, I would guess. You know, it's not going to be as fast as what you can get in a 13 or 15-inch chassis with Sandy Bridge enabled, or that ships with Sandy Bridge. But, you know, it's good enough for a lot of these workloads. Personally, I do a lot of my work on, you know, a very, very similar setup, and you know, you can do photo editing with it, you can do video editing with it, although if you're going to do really, really long time transcodes and stuff like that, you're going to want a quad-core machine or something like that. So like I said, performance is sufficient for it if you're a writer, if you do a lot of kind of on-the-go work and don't need a lot of CPU-intensive tasks, if you don't do a lot of like video transcoding, offline 3D rendering, so on and so forth. So CPU performance is decent. Overall system responsiveness is excellent. Again, it's due to the fact that this is a SSD only machine. So boot time I clocked at 16.7 seconds. So that's actually a hair faster than the 11-inch Air. Resume time, Asus does suspend to RAM. So there's no none of this like hybrid suspend to RAM and disk stuff going on. Because of that, resume time is consistently right about 2 seconds. I typically measured like 2.04 to 2.2 seconds in terms of resume time. It's as close to instant as you can get. Unfortunately, hooking up Wi-Fi after that does take a couple more seconds. So it's not like you can open it up and just immediately continue browsing where you were before. But overall response time is excellent. Application launch time is awesome. I mean, these are all benefits that you get from an SSD, and it's just good to see that the SSD is kind of coming standard with a lot of these Ultrabooks. And I'm also appreciative of the fact that Asus went for a 100% SSD configuration. So there's no caching or anything like that. It's all you get is an SSD. There's no mechanical storage here. If you look at I/O options, you've got a USB 2 port on the left side of the device and a USB 3 port on the right side of the device. There's actually like a two separate PCBs in there, and I'm guessing just the pain of routing that USB 3 controller to the USB 3 port on the other side of it kind of made it impossible to have two USB 3 ports. But if you look at overall performance over USB 3, it's awesome. You know, you're getting about 150 megabytes per second if you've got a fast enough USB 3 device connected, versus about 26 megs per second over USB 2. Recently, I've been in a number of situations where I've had to move a ton of data over USB, and I really, really appreciate having USB 3 there. So I think that was a good move. In terms of other outputs, you've got a mini VGA and micro HDMI. So Asus actually provides a mini VGA dongle. You have to buy a micro HDMI adapter. Out of mini VGA, you can drive a 19x12 panel, and out of the HDMI port, you can drive a 1080p panel. Both work very well. There's a keyboard combination to kind of toggle between cloning your display or just doing the external display or doing the internal display only. All of that works very, very well. Asus also provides a USB to Ethernet adapter. Obviously, with the Z height on this machine, you can't have an integrated Ethernet port, but all the Zenbooks come with USB Ethernet adapter. It's only 100 megabit Ethernet, and as a result, you know, you don't get the best transfer rates in the world, but I can get over 90% utilization on 100 megabit, so it does work out pretty well. Normally, I would recommend just using wireless, but this is only the controller in here. It's a Qualcomm Atheros that's 2.4 gigahertz only and is only capable of single spatial stream. So if you've got 20 megahertz channels, you're looking at 72 megabit link rate. And if you've got 40 megahertz channels through channel bonding, you're looking at 150 megabit link rate. Now, actual transfer speeds will be about half that. So you're looking at 5 to 10 megabytes per second over Wi-Fi, which isn't great, especially given the kind of 2x2 with two spatial streams, 5 gigahertz solutions you can get in a lot of the high-end systems today, or even beyond that. So that's one area that I'd like to see Asus improve, but by far not the biggest. The biggest issue I have with this machine is the display. So in an effort to kind of offer better specs on paper, it seems, the panel is much, much brighter than, for example, the MacBook Air. Asus has unfortunately sacrificed both viewing angle and black levels with this thing. And as a result, you don't get competitive contrast ratio with the MacBook Air. You know, it's better. I measured somewhere around, depending on how you have the panel configured, if you have some of its power savings turned on or off, you're looking at 200 to 400 to 1 contrast ratio, which isn't great, but it's not terrible either. The bigger problem is when you compare it directly to the MacBook Air, that just boasts an overall better black level. You're looking at the brightness on a black screen of being about half of what it is on the UX21 base case scenario. Overall, that's my biggest complaint. The display is really disappointing in my eyes. The keyboard is excellent. It's a little stiffer than I'd like, but it's something you do get used to. The trackpad feels great. It's nice to use, but there's some serious driver issues with it right now. A number of times I found that there was just like this high latency wake up time where, you know, I'm typing, I go to use the trackpad and it doesn't really respond right away. And then like a second later, it'll respond. The other issue is the bounding box at the bottom of the trackpad where clicks are supposed to be registered. Unless your finger or your thumb is there, if it's anywhere else on the trackpad, you can't have two fingers or a finger and a thumb on the trackpad at the same time. It kind of disables all pointer motion at that point. And these are all things that can be addressed in software, and Asus has already kind of committed to me that we're going to see another driver drop in the next week, and that'll significantly improve things, and then it's going to continue to address trackpad issues going forward. But that kind of rounds out the issues. Everything else about the system, you know, I didn't even talk about the design, but from a design standpoint, this is probably the prettiest thing Asus has ever made, and arguably one of the prettiest notebooks I've ever seen. You know, even side by side with like a MacBook Air, it actually looks a little more striking. It's got this aluminum unibody construction. The material itself is actually a little tougher than what Apple uses in its MacBook lineup. And it's got this brushed finish along the keyboard side, along the main chassis side, and it's got a kind of circular brush that takes place over the display side. Overall, it's a beautiful system. And it's very solid. The build quality is great. There's no weird chassis flex or squeaking or creaking or any of that. The keyboard, like I mentioned, it's excellent. It's fun to type on. It's a little too stiff, but that's it. The ports are all easily accessible. I mean, everything is where you'd expect it to be. Even the power brick. The power brick is very well styled. Obviously paying homage to the MacBook power bricks there. Cable management's done through just a standard Velcro strap, and you've got a little LED that indicates charging or not on the connector side of the power adapter. But overall, the whole package is great. The two areas that I wish Asus had spent more time with, again, are display and the trackpad. Now, the trackpad, Asus says driver updates are coming. That could be fixed. This is the display. Asus is currently evaluating what options it has for the second gen UX series. But honestly, if I were Asus, I'd try and address the issues as soon as possible within this family. Because I feel like that's the only thing that really keeps this from being a great machine. It's a viable competitor today. If you want a good ultra-thin Windows notebook, this thing does work, and it does work very, very well. The display is the thing that bothers me the most, and it's a simple fix. From my understanding, the difference between this panel and the MacBook Air panel is a simple swap of filters between the LCD panel and the polarizer. Apple opted for one that kind of clamped brightness levels, obviously clamped black levels as a result, and improved viewing angles, whereas Asus went for a 3M film that kind of increases brightness output and as a result also increases black levels and decreases viewing angle. It helps win some of the specs on paper, but in practice, this is one of the only times where I really wish Asus had just gone the Apple route and copied what was in the MacBook Air. So if I were in Asus's shoes, I would do another rev of this thing just to fix the display, because if you can address that and you can address the trackpad issues, then this thing's honestly an awesome machine. With the issues, kind of where it is today, it works if you don't really have the highest display quality standards. The trackpad is usable. It's not perfect, but it's usable. It's something you can get used to. I've been using it for the past few days as like my sole writing machine, and obviously I've been able to complete the review, and I didn't feel overly hindered by it. And like I said, if you're not used to the highest quality in displays, you can get by with this thing. I would like to see better, but it's the type of thing that you can deal with if you have to. But I'd much rather you not. I'd much rather Asus just address it and put out an even better product. Now, if you want the full results, full test data, I go into a lot more detail on a lot of these issues and more. Check out the full review at Anontech. Thanks for watching.